Well, good morning, everybody. Delighted to see you all back at this IUCN UK Peatland Programme annual conference. Fantastic that we're all here again, at least virtually, and let's hope we can have a physical session in the future. We're now going to move on to risks to sustainable peatland conservation and management. This session is going to explore risks to delivering sustainable management, including overlooking the historic environment, the role of finance for payment for public goods, and risks and opportunities associated with completing land use. And we're going to focus on forestry and renewable energy. So we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers, a really interesting crowd. So I think you're going to enjoy this one. And we're going to start with Ben Gearey. He's a peatland archaeologist. He cut his teeth on Bodmin Moor and then on the Humber Wetlands project where I met him a long time ago. He's now a lecturer in environmental archaeology at the University College Cork, and he's been a cheerleader for peatland archaeology on the IUCN UK Peatland Programme for a long time. He led the Commission of Inquiry, the piece on historic environment, the Peatlands and Historic Environment Review. And Ben's going to speak to us about not forgetting the risks or not forgetting archaeology when we do peatland restoration. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Rob. It's inevitable. I hope everyone can hear me moment of the online conference, so I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks very much. I'm talking today about archaeology. Just a couple of points before I start. We've got an online poll running, which I hope should be apparent in the stream. I think it's to the right-hand side. So if people would like to answer that, that'd be brilliant as we go along. Also, just to add as well, please feel free to tweet away if you want. So I don't think I'm showing or talking about anything that can't be tweeted more broadly. So if you want to do that, please do feel free. Okay, so that was a nice intro by Rob there. I'm going to begin. Where were we? I think a question has been asking over the last 18 months. I was surprised to find, actually, slightly shocked that it's over a decade since the first peatland reviews by the IUCN. And as Rob just mentioned, I was involved in that initial review and all the way back in 2010. It feels a long, long time ago now, with a number of other colleagues. So you can see there on screen. And again, it owes a lot to the foresight of the IUCN Peatland Programme and also Historic England, or English Heritage as they were at that point, who sponsored this review, that we got historic environments onto the agenda. I must admit, the expression historic environment seems to have stuck. I don't really like it. I mean, we're talking, I suppose, about archaeology, paleoecology, and cultural aspects of peatlands in the broadest sense as well. But historic environment is the word we have, so let's just go with it. So again, just to kind of remind ourselves, and again, I'm probably teaching some people to suck eggs, what the value of peats and peatlands is in this sense. So for the review, we kind of split value, if you like, into kind of 4 categories. So from the kind of ground up, if you like, we have the value of what's preserved beneath peat, what we call sub-peat archaeology. Then we have, I suppose, what is most generally kind of perceived as the real value of peat, of archaeology in peatlands, and that is archaeology within the peat. So most normally in the kind of space of the best known form, organic remains. I'll show some pictures in a minute. And then, of course, we sort of forget what's on the top of the peat, potentially evidence of exploitation of peat in historic or in some cases prehistoric periods as well. And then, of course, we have the value of peat in the sense that it preserves the paleoecological record. And, of course, the important thing here is that every peat deposit has some value under that heading, irrespective of the presence of cultural archaeology, if we want to use that word. So, again, we could spend all day looking at beautiful pictures of organic archaeology. And again, some of the best known now would be bog bodies, of course. Generally, when you mention peatland archaeology or peat and archaeology, bog bodies are mentioned. Extremely iconic finds, very important, very rare actually, a very rare class of finds from most peatlands, but ones that tend to occupy the popular imagination, and I suppose the headlines as well. Again, other examples of pre-peat or sub-peat archaeology here. We have the Cagey Fields over here in Western Ireland. We also have other peatlands where we have field systems or walls or settlements preserved beneath peat. Super peat, peat cuttings on Exmoor up there. Again, some of you may well be aware of the Exmoor peat cuttings and some of the issues around that in the past. And then just an image there of the paleoecological record. So we're talking about pollen, plant macrofossils, beetle remains, tephra, all these kind of things. Testate media, of course, very important as well. So all these kind of things that are preserved within peat. Again, just some more lovely pictures, because why not? On the left here, we have a Neolithic timber trackway from the site of Edacloon over here in Ireland, County Longford. This has just been published, actually, very, very recent publication, extremely important site for Irish peatland archaeology and peatland archaeology more broadly, I think. Cathy Moore's work, and you can see that's this beautiful Neolithic trackway, about 6,000 years old. Of course, the lowland peat there. Upland peatlands, which I imagine is kind of, in terms of this conference, is something that people are dealing with more. I think that's probably right. In many ways, a kind of a bit of a tricky situation with upland peatlands. We really don't know a huge amount about what's up there. But what we do know is when we find stuff, it tends to be very valuable. So 2 examples from Dartmoor here. Again, some of you may well be familiar with these sites. So we've got an early Neolithic stone row, so inorganic archaeology in this case, on central northern Dartmoor. And we have the White Horse Bronze Age cyst or kist on Dartmoor as well. There preserves some remarkable archaeological remains, a burial in a bearskin bag. Again, this is the work of Ralph Fife and colleagues as well. So potentially these are rare finds or rare sites, but when they are there, they're extremely important, I think is an important aspect of this discussion. Again, obviously archaeology is at threat, and very broadly speaking, whatever happens to a peatland, and the archaeology within it is tied to that fate. So degrading peatlands are broadly bad for archaeology. And again, this is an illustration of this. I won't take you through it in detail. This is from the recently published Historic England Guidance on Peatlands and Historic Environments. But this attempts to summarise in a kind of schematic way some of the threats, what we might call direct threats, so physical removal of peat, as well as indirect threats. That is, of course, drainage, drawdown of water that will, of course, affect organic archaeology as well. So that's a kind of summary there. When we did the original review, we attempted to kind of look quite broadly at the review areas and what we called harmonies and conflicts. I'm not sure they're great expressions now. But again, you don't need to read this in detail. It's available in the online publication. But really, again, to make this point is that broadly restoration, rehabilitation is good for archaeology, it should be. Maintenance of high water tables, actual functioning peatland ecosystems should be good for archaeologists in situ. There are potential conflicts, and this is, I think, is something that we focus on and discuss quite a bit, and that is particularly inadvertent damage potentially to archaeological remains during restoration or rehabilitation programs, and that's perhaps something we might talk about a bit later on. So again, broadly, we have good harmonies here. A couple of points to be made, though, and this is another archaeological site that we excavated some years ago now on Hatfield Moors, over there in North Lincolnshire. You can see the site at the top there. You can see it's been cut through by a drain. It's been impacted by peat cutting. It's only survived because it's right at the bottom of the peat, basically. So again, this is a very old site, 6,000 years old. But also potentially inadvertently damaged by, for example, the construction of bunds or the movement of peat, the removal of peat. Of course, any movement of peat, in situ peat, has the potential to destroy or damage archaeology. So that's quite obvious. And an important point to be made here, I think, is that restoration is good for archaeology, but of course it will not regenerate sites that are damaged already. So, for example, the Hatfield Moors trackway is currently, or what remains of it, preserved in situ. We don't actually know what condition it remains in for a variety of reasons. But of course, preserving in situ will not regenerate it, will not recover to the state it was in originally. So unlike, arguably, other ecosystem services, we cannot restore our archaeological record where it is damaged by re-wetting. That is an important, if obvious, point to make. And another important point here is archaeology is a finite and non-renewable resource. And I think it's not really kind of exaggerating to say that for many sites, not just in England, but also in Ireland and further afield in Europe, restoration programs represent maybe the last chance to preserve what is left and what survives in peatlands, and also opportunities that perhaps we're missing to investigate what is there before rehabilitation programs begin. Okay, so there are synergies there. I think my take home is we need to chase and pursue those synergies a bit better than we are. And that doesn't go for everyone, by the way. There are very good examples of where this is works and is working. Just take my time. Where are we now? So where are we now? So, zipping forward 10 years, as I say, there's been a lot of good work and a lot of good progress on this front. Next More Miles project, I'll just flag up there. We had more to talk earlier. It was excellent, by the way. I really enjoyed it. And again, in many ways, if we talk about best practice, that is something I think we're looking at really, and trying to get these kind of harmonies operating as well as we can. More recently, if we look at earlier this year, I think this is a very important development, and I'm just going to finish off by just talking very briefly about this. And this is of course, Natural England and Historic England's work with DEFRA, and DEFRA have been very important here in trying to bring historic environment back into peatland restoration. So again, this is the Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Scheme Guide for Applicants, Annex 5, which is peatland restoration and historic environment, as you can see there. And again, you can download, and many of you I'm sure may have read this already, and I'm not going to pull you through this in detail, but just a couple of quotes here. So the important thing to note here is that the fact that the historic environment is now on the agenda for us, and the assessment of the potential of sites and landscapes for the preservation of archaeology and paleoecology for that matter. So not just protecting that record or ensuring it's protected as far as we can, it's also, I think, thinking of better ways to use the historic environment to promote peatland restoration. And this is something I've talked about at the IUCN before. And again, there are examples of people and projects doing that. I'm very much aware of that. So again, in terms of guidance, the DEFRA, Natural England DEFRA work has been tied into the very good work of Historic England. Again, Historic England, like many public bodies, has been under huge pressure. So the fact that they've been able to kind of come in on this and put time into it has been fantastic. But again, really, in terms of guidance, that is now available, peatlands and historic environments, introduction to their culture and heritage value. So again, the aim, what are we talking about? Peatland restoration schemes must deliver long-term protection of historic environment features and paleoenvironmental remains. And again, I'm not going to drag you through those points there, but that's an important point to note. Is that, however, I think another important point here is not to see the historic environment as some kind of chain around your neck or something that you kind of a box that needs to be ticked. The historic environment, whether that's archaeology or paleoecology, is, I think, an enabler when it comes to restoration and rehabilitation programs. This is something we've been working on, myself and colleague Dr. Rosie Everett, our Wet Futures project. We've been working closely with peatland groups in Ireland, and we've got a couple of things coming up. Working with those groups, using the historic environment to encourage the public and local communities to think about bogs and to think about what bogs are, to think about the time depth of peatland systems, what they preserve and what they represent. And I say we've been working very closely with groups on that front, and I think that's proving very successful and certainly really rewarding. And again, there's other examples of work by ourselves and colleagues, and I'm sure there's people out there who are doing this work as well, which is great. Project Wildscape on Hatfield Moors, I mentioned earlier, with colleagues such as Nikki Whitehouse, Professor Henry Chapman, and again, engaging the community and thinking of ways to connect people back to their peatland landscapes. And this is really to finish. This is the work on Hatfield Moors. I don't know how many of you saw this. This was the work with the Isle of Axone Hatfield Chase Landscape Partnership, Heritage Lottery funding. And that was a project that involved, I showed you earlier, the Hatfield Trackway. This is a project that involved us rebuilding a replica of that trackway, scale replica, not full size. And that brought in local people. We had really good engagement, the community of builders, as they were known. And there's now, the replica is available on Hatfield Moors. We also had the bonus of also helping with scrub clearance at the edge of the moors there. You can see that's Mark Griffiths, who was the woodworker who led this project, working with a replica Neolithic axe to chop down some birch trees. And that really proved enormously successful. We had a fantastic open day. And that brought in not just the people who built the trackway, but children and interested people locally. And again, that's bringing people onto Hatfield Moors, which again, some of you may know, Hatfield Moors actually have to be going there to visit it. So again, these kind of events I think are really important. And I think we might be missing a trick in some projects. I think thinking of ways to maybe incorporate this into our programs is important. Okay, look, I'm going to finish a bit early there. I've whizzed through that. I hope there's been some food for thought. And I hope some. Oh, and yes, I'm just hearing the voice from beyond that's telling me the results of the poll are going to be brought up. So hopefully that's going to appear. Okay. Okay, I can't see. Oh, there we go. So I can see them on screen. I beg your pardon. Let me just see now. Okay, that's really interesting. So I was asking a poll about how many people have historic environment incorporated into their schemes. There's some good figures coming through there. For some reason, I can't make that go bigger, Rob. I don't know why. I can't make that go bigger. I don't know if my other device has gone offline. So I'll finish at that point, and we can back to those results once I'm able to kind of read the numbers a bit more clearly. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was a great presentation. Thank you. And it just shows, doesn't it, that our peatlands are both fantastic natural environments, of course they are, but they're also incredible cultural environments, and that cultural environment stretching back, way back beyond the Neolithic. You can think of Starkar and the Mesolithic remains at Starkar, and all the way through all of these different remains and the paleoenvironmental record, and right up to the cultural considerations of today's people that live and work in and around our peatlands. I forgot to introduce myself earlier on, so just to say I'm Rob Stoneman. I'm a Director of Landscape Recovery at the Wildlife Trust. I've been involved in peatland conservation for decades now. I started my career with Scottish Wildlife Trust on the Scottish Lowland Raised Bog Project, and helped set up this IUCN UK Peatland Programme and the Yorkshire Peat Partnership with Yorkshire Wildlife Trust when I was Chief Executive there. But enough of me. Let's move on to our next brilliant speaker. So we're going to move on and talk about finance, and particularly the role of blended finance. So we're going to move on to Brendan Turvey. He's the low carbon project manager for NatureScot, and he'll be speaking to us about the financial challenges of peatland restoration and how we can blend public and private finance to help meet the next challenge. And just to remind you, do ask questions and answers through the question tab on the chat screen. And if you like one of the questions that have been asked, then click on the button and it will rise up the agenda and be more likely to be asked at the end. Thank you very much. Okay, Brendan.
Hi everyone, and thank you to the IUCN team for inviting me along today to talk about blended finance and what we're trying to do to attract more private investment into peatland restoration in Scotland. What I'm planning to cover in my presentation today is the investment gap between the funds we have available now and what we think we need to invest to fully restore our peatlands in Scotland, and why blended finance is essential to us achieving that. I'm going to quickly talk about the public money available through Peatland Action, the private money largely being invested through the Peatland Code, how those two different processes can work together, and what we're doing in NatureScot with Scottish Government to try and make it easier for people to invest in peatland restoration in Scotland. And then I'll just conclude with a couple of key thoughts as to how you can all help us achieve that in this sector. So the investment gap. So as many of you know, we're currently restoring around about 5,000 to 6,000 hectares of peatland in Scotland each year. That's a great achievement. But we know that to hit our climate change targets, we need to substantially increase that restoration rate up to around about 35,000 hectares per annum if we're going to achieve our targets for net zero. So there's a significant scaling up required. What's that going to cost? Well, at the moment, we've got £250 million of public money from the Scottish Government committed to the Peatland Action Programme through to 2030. But our guesstimated costs, and I emphasise the word guesstimated because it's quite a crude analysis, but our estimated cost of restoration work is around about 670 million. And we've estimated that the cost of restoring all of our peatlands beyond 2030, that's 1.3 million hectares, is in the region of £3 to £4 billion. So that gives you a feel for the scale of the investment gap. So why do we need blended finance? Well, evidently, there's not enough public funding available to restore all of the peatlands, or not at the moment anyway. And therefore, we need to try and generate some alternative funding mechanisms to bring private finance and finance from other sources into the restoration sector. So our view is that by blending finance with public and private, we can potentially develop a revenue stream for land managers. So beyond the initial capital grants from ourselves through Peatland Action, we can potentially bring finance into the project to pay for further restoration activity, maintenance activity, and also to try and generate a revenue stream for the land manager to incentivise them to keep their peatlands in good condition. But also potentially through blended finance, we can offer opportunities for communities to invest or to develop shared ownership models whereby communities can potentially benefit themselves from peatland restoration projects on their own land or indeed land near to them. So blended finance offers some flexibility and a number of potential benefits as well. So in terms of the public funding available, I think most of you will be aware of the Peatland Action Project here in Scotland. We've got a network of project officers around the country, and they're working day in, day out with restoration projects across the country, funding feasibility studies, offering technical advice, and ultimately offering grants of up to 100% for capital costs of restoration projects. At the same time, we've got the Peatland Code, and I think most people in the audience today will know probably more about the Peatland Code than I do. But it's at the moment the main mechanism through which private finance can be brought to the table. But we're aware that it may not be attractive for all restoration projects. So restoration of peatlands which are in quite good condition already, and therefore deliver quite low carbon savings, are less likely to be attractive to private investors. And that's where public funds could potentially fill that gap. And at the same time, for those projects which are attractive to the code, we can provide up to 85% of those project costs through Peatland Action, and therefore we can blend the public and private finance together and give a substantial boost to the project in terms of public investment. And we've also demonstrated that in Scotland we can satisfy the additionality test and blend our finance quite successfully in that way. So what are we trying to do to make it easier to help that blended finance happen? Well, there's a number of actions that we've identified working with Scottish Government, the IUCN team and others. And those are principally around aligning processes for applying for the Peatland Action process and the Peatland Code. We're also increasing resources in the Peatland Action team so we can offer as much help, advice and support to applicants as we can. We're working with Scottish Government to investigate whether a price floor for peatland restoration in Scotland would be appropriate, similar to the Woodland Carbon Guarantee that most of you will be aware of. And that project's running until early in 2022. Once that project's reached a conclusion, we will be reviewing the Peatland Action funding model to try and make sure that it is suiting the market as best as it possibly can, depending on whether a price floor is introduced or not. And we've got a number of options we've identified already to review that model, but we're going to pause our thinking of that until the question of a price floor has been concluded. Some of you might know we've already moved to multi-year funding, so we can now offer funding over 3 years for projects, providing certainty both to the land manager, third parties who are working with them, and perhaps most importantly to the contractors who are doing the work on the ground. And behind the scenes, we're working with government, SEPA, other agencies to try and reduce other barriers to investment, so deer densities, clarity on subsidies post-Brexit, and so on. So we've got quite a long list of things we're working away on to try and remove in the background, just to make it easier for that investment to flow into peatland restoration. And then finally, we're working with others in the green finance sector to try and develop alternative revenue streams for restoration. So at the moment, carbon is the main market. But as I think many of you will know, there's potential for a wide range of alternative revenue streams for the other ecosystem benefits that peatland restoration provides. And this slide shows some of those. I think many of them will be familiar to you all. But at the moment, carbon is really the only one where a land manager can develop a revenue stream today. But our ambition is that over the next couple of years, we can develop additional revenue streams, which can either be stacked or bundled with carbon credits to provide additional revenue to the land manager. So longer term, we're obviously aware that we need to be quite careful as to how we intervene in this market. There are some risks that we're aware of. First of all, that we crowd out private investment by offering public money at too generous a rate. So that's something we're now keeping under constant review. The second is that we can potentially target public funding at certain types of peatland to try and make sure that the code and Peatland Action are working alongside each other rather than against each other. But as I said before, we're also very conscious now that as this market starts to mature, we need to monitor that to try and make sure that the Peatland Action funding model is doing the best it can to support the market, and is creating space for private investment rather than competing with it. So just to conclude, how can you help? Well, there's a couple of things I'd like to ask you to do. The first is please help us streamline the application processes by giving us your feedback, and the Peatland Action email address is on the bottom of this slide. The second is that as we mature this market, we really need your help and advice to make sure we get that blending of finance right between public and private. And we very much need feedback from everybody across the sector to try and help us make sure that that blend is appropriate throughout the maturation of this sector. The third is the earlier that applicants to Peatland Action can apply in the financial year, the better. At the moment, we tend to have a sort of a lump of applications in August and September each year, which is quite compressed before the winter restoration season. Ideally, now that we've moved to multi-year funding, we'd really like to see applications coming in throughout and earlier in the financial year to help us smooth out the application process. And then fourth and finally, we're very keen to see applicants working with their neighbours at the landscape scale. That's both to scale up projects over a larger number of hectares, but also to make sure we can address issues of restoration on one side, woodland planting on the next, and other types of land use which may well be interacting with that peatland restoration. So we're increasingly encouraging applicants to start working with their neighbours to try and make sure that we can have as integrated an approach as possible. So that was a very quick whistle-stop tour as to what we're doing to try and increase private investment. I'd love to hear your feedback. My email address is on this slide, and I look forward to any thoughts and questions in the Q&A session later.
Well, thank you very much, Brendan. That was an amazing switch through, and we have so much to learn from the Peatland Action in Scotland. I think for the other UK countries, we could, well, wouldn't it be great if we had a Peatland Action scheme in every country of the UK? But please do ask questions of Brendan if you want any more information. And on questions, please do continue to ask questions as we go through these talks. Use the question and answer tab on the right-hand side. And if you like a particular question, do like it. And we're going to continue this theme of financing peatlands over in England now with Naomi Oakley, who's the programme lead for Peatlands for Natural England, with a particular focus on implementing the England Peatland Plan. Naomi can teach us so much about so many things about peatlands. She's just focused on finance here, but she grew up and still lives on a farm in Dartmoor, right in the midst of the peatlands, and really understands these habitats and particularly the role of regenerative farming in this area. But over to you, Naomi, about finance. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Naomi Oakley, Principal Advisor in the Strategy and Government Advice Team of Natural England, and I'm here today to talk to you about blended finance in England. I thought I'd start with recent finance-related announcements in England. That's things that have happened since the last IUCN conference in 2020. The major things that I wanted to think about were the launch of the UK Land Carbon Registry, the forthcoming accreditation of the Peatland Code to UKAS, and funding expansion to lowland fens. Something that's been close to my own heart, the design of the Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Scheme, so it encourages the blending of private finance with public funds via the Peatland Code. And that will be for the restoration and for the discovery grants. And I think that's really exciting, and we can hopefully show some really good practice through that. And the other fund, which I think is being used to leverage private finance into new markets, is the £20 million Big Nature Impact Fund run by the Environment Agency. I think there'll be more details on that coming out soon, and that looks like it could be really exciting. On the horizon, things that are coming that I think are going to be hugely important to us for finance and also for building the framework beneath those finance proposals. There's a proposal for a new greenhouse gas removals programme looking at new technologies for sequestering carbon in peat. This has been led by Chris Evans. And if it's successful, it could lead to the inclusion of sequestration as well as avoided emissions in the Peatland Code. To me, that's a massive thing. The whole peat and trees argument that it's just ongoing. Is so there's such a lack of parity between peat and trees because of that, and I think we end up always looking like we don't like trees But it's not that we don't like trees, we just don't like trees in the wrong place. There's plenty of space for peatland restoration and for a lot of tree planting before we start causing any problems. The introduction of conservation covenants through the delayed environment bill, so that the measures that we buy through capital works and restoration of peatlands are kept permanently through the peatland code. Really, really exciting stuff. The potential to use biodiversity net gain funding for undesignated peatland sites. Many of our peatland sites are designated, but there are a few that aren't, especially our wasted peats, which have always been the sort of Cinderella habitats that we've kind of come to last of all, but are actually desperately important. We've got so much opportunity for restoring wasted peats, and we know that the England peat map will help us with that. And other evidence that's on stream. I think it's a really exciting time for that. And using these multiple funds and multiple sources is really exciting. And two other things, I think. I'm interested in thinking about the Peatland Carbon Guarantee, which is in Annex 1 of the England Peat Action Plan. But I think that how Scotland has progressed this already is so far ahead of where we are. There's a lot we can learn. So I'll defer to Brendan on that. So innovative peatland projects. I think there are things going on that you look at and just think they're so exciting. They're really wonderful. And two of the Environment Agency's Investment Readiness Fund projects are ones that I look to and I'm very impressed by. So we've got Wilder Carbon that's looking at a rewilding standard that could be applied to the uplands. It has the opportunity to capture multiple public benefits and is very appealing to a lot of people because everybody likes a bit of rewilding and anything that's at that end of the spectrum of a more natural process. We've also got the UK Farm Soil Carbon Code, which is under development, and it could be really exciting if that can be applied to paludiculture on deep peat. Our lowland peats are our biggest emitters, and it's really important that we look at ways that we can manage those so that we can reduce those emissions. But, and there's always a but, I feel, and there's a lot of feedback, that there's growing concern about people buying up large tracts of land for forestry or for peat restoration as a business opportunity, really. And it's currently constrained by very high land values, but there's an uncertainty about the future funding for land management. And so land managers at the moment are holding on to their land, so there's not a lot of land available, which is ratcheting the price up even more. And there's also the volatility about people not knowing what's going to happen in the future. So it's a difficult time for land managers, and they feel quite unsure. I think a lot of thought needs to be given to the pace and scale of change, whether it's in the uplands or the lowlands, and to think about the wider impacts on rural communities, about that change from maybe a farmed landscape to a forested landscape or a landscape that's managed for peat. And I know these things will go in mosaics, and you'll have different spatial and temporal activity, but thinking about how people fit into those landscapes and making people care about it and have ownership is all very important and something I'm personally particularly interested in. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Naomi. That was fantastic, and it just shows that England does seem to be starting to catch up with Scotland on peatland restoration, particularly the government schemes, which is great to see. You picked up on many of the issues of competing land use, which does rather introduce the next speaker rather well, because we're going to focus now on two competing land use. Firstly, forestry, and then we'll talk about wind farms. But you obviously talked about agriculture as well, which has been one of the big competing land uses for peatlands. across the UK. But we're going to move on to forestry now. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, which is Clifton Bain. I hardly need to introduce him. He's known to all of us. He's been at the centre of UK efforts to conserve peatlands for over 30 years. I first met Clifton a very long time ago, campaigning for the cessation of peat extraction on Thorn and Hatfield moors, probably back in the early 1990s. Long time at RSPB, leading the charge on climate change. He's been director of the IUCN UK Peatland Programme and is now our principal advisor. And he's going to talk to you about the risk of forestry as competing land use on peatland restoration. Over to you, Clifton.
Welcome to this presentation on land use conflicts and forestry and peatlands. Both forestry and peatlands have been central to my career over the last 35 years, and I'm passionate about both. Forests and peatlands are our two greatest natural land-based carbon stores. They're both essential in tackling climate change and biodiversity crises. However, there have been recent, quite controversial conflicts, as indeed there have been in the past 30 or so decades. The IUCN Peatland Programme recently published a position statement on peatlands and trees using evidence from our Commission of Inquiry update, and you can find all these on our website. We also have IUCN Resolution 43, a global resolution seeking inclusion of peatlands alongside forests in all intergovernmental agreements on climate change and biodiversity. And it's notable that many of these agreements talk about forests, but don't talk about the equally important peatland ecosystems. The resolution also recommends that member states consider peatlands when undertaking forestry activity. We're not the only country to have had conflicts between trees and peat. The UK has been pursuing a very vigorous forest planting effort. There are now high-level targets for forest planting and restocking influenced by the climate change goals. And this is creating pressure on our peatlands, which are often, because of being undervalued, are often seen as the easy place to go for planting trees, or the cheaper place to go. And we also have a research and policy community fixated with which is better, trees or peat. As Harry Hill would say, bring on the fight. So what is the conflict? We have nearly 20% of the UK peatlands have been converted to forestry, much of that done prior to 1990. But it's remarkable how there has still been an increase with 24,000 hectares of forestry on peat between 1990 and 2013. The impact of planting trees on peatlands is associated with the drainage, ploughing and planting activity, fertiliser application, as well as the harvesting operations. And these have several impacts, including direct loss of peatland habitats and species, with wider edge effects where birds abandon or have lower productivity on adjacent peatland. The planting also affects the ecosystem, hydrology, peat structure, and ultimately the carbon store, even beyond the planting boundary. The climate change implications of trees on peats is basically a misdirection. We shouldn't be planting trees on peat and attempting to justify it on carbon grounds. This will lead to bad forestry and damaged peatlands. The carbon pathways are complex, and there have been very few studies, if any, that have embraced all the different pathways. And whilst it's fair to say we haven't got all the information, we do understand some aspects, and some of it we understand very well. We know that trees on peatlands lead to significant carbon losses, but we're unclear as to whether forest growth can compensate or not for these peatland carbon losses. It's important that we also recognise shallow peatlands as major carbon stores. Even a 30-centimetre peatland can have as much carbon in it than a whole tropical rainforest. And these shallow peatlands can release carbon rapidly when drained or undergoing forest ploughing. We also know that forest to bog restoration brings about significant emissions reductions. And there's the added potential for sequestration benefits as the sphagnum recovers, and in some cases recovering to such a degree that it can sequester more carbon than a growing plantation. Even if, and it has been shown in some circumstances, even if the trees sequester more carbon than is lost from the peatland, that in itself doesn't justify planting on peatlands. The net result is a compromised forest, delivering less climate benefit than it otherwise would. In addition, it's harming biodiversity, and I would argue it's of limited commercial use, as well as being a stressed forest, more susceptible to disease and more likely to spread disease, and suffer under the impacts of climate change. It's explained on the slide there, a nice summary from our Commission of Inquiry report. Over long time horizons, afforestation translocates carbon from a peat reservoir that is secure over millennia to a reactive wood store that can be lost to the atmosphere within a few decades. Tackling the climate change emergency and meeting the Paris goals needs all our land use and natural habitats working at their best without compromising one for the other. A reminder that in the UK, our wet Atlantic climate doesn't facilitate trees on peatlands. The bog expanse is generally too wet and nutrient poor. But where we do see trees on peatlands is on areas that have been disturbed even centuries ago with lower water tables, as well as in the shallower peats and peatland edges and in the natural mineral-rich flushes within peat mires. The fossil record demonstrates this, with trees often found at the base of the peat profile or on the peat margins and in the thinner peats, usually from around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, before the peat started to take over as a result of both climate change at the time and human influence. And this is something where we've seen that the fossil record shows very few trees in the bog expanse since that period. But trees and peatlands can coexist. The photograph above me is of a wonderful peatland within the Glen Affric native pinewood that's been naturally growing there for 10,000 years, and the peat bog itself has provided valuable paleoecological information about the surrounding woodland. And what's clear is the two have survived side by side for thousands of years. What's important is to recognise that it's only where the peatland is undisturbed and healthy that it can survive in that wooded environment, with the trees growing on the shallower, more mineral soils adjacent and not invading the wet, healthy peatland. We have a European habitat of importance called bog woodland, and as some people would point out, it's largely just trees taking advantage of more suitable conditions within a bog landscape. Bog woodland is a rare and distinct ecological feature, and it's not an excuse for large-scale forest on peat. And I have heard it being promoted as such. It's important to look at the missing trees. And I'm uncomfortably close to a cow's bottom in that bottom photograph, but that shows a lowland bog in central Scotland. And typical with most lowland raised bogs in the UK, you have a lens of peat, a dome of peat in an agricultural landscape, and what's missing is the natural fen carr woodland that would have occupied the circumference of the bog. It's been lost because the woodland was accessible in these lowland environments and the land was more profitable for agriculture, so the woodland went. But it is an important part of the ecology of these peatlands and vital for many of the peatland species to have that neighbouring fen carr woodland. We also have in the uplands, the photograph of the blancmange above me. That is something that Richard Lindsay has been developing as an exciting hypothesis, that the upper hill slopes in an upland environment, historically and across the world, have had woodlands surrounding the blanket bog on the summit, and that it provides a stabilising effect to the blanket bog, helping secure it. And I've put the link into a wonderful talk by Richard where he beautifully demonstrates this hypothesis with blancmange. In recent decades, it's fair to say, we've seen some fantastic progress with forest to bog restoration on both lowland raised bogs and on the vast expanses of blanket bogs such as the flows. The work's been carried out both on the public forest estate as well as major NGO projects, and to be fair to the wind farm industry, we've seen some wonderful peatland restoration works in forests adjacent to the wind farms. And the methods for forest to bog restoration have certainly been proven and tested, and they're working. And they're cost effective. And that's again some of the work that's been done for our Commission of Inquiry update, looking at forest to bog methods, restoration methods. We also have to consider that within peatland landscapes, as occurred naturally, there is opportunity for native woodland, and that regenerating native woodland back onto areas of shallow peatland in some cases is going to be necessary to help vulnerable remnants of native woodland which are too small and isolated to be viable, and they need to be expanded and reoccupy the areas that probably through human intervention became deforested. But we have to get this right. It's not all shallow peatland, and when you're putting new forest, ideally by natural regeneration, you've got to be careful that any adjacent deep peat that should remain as bog is in a healthy condition to withstand invasion from the trees, so that if you have a damaged, degraded peatland adjacent to your new native woodland, it's vulnerable if the water table isn't naturally high and stable. And so getting the timing right so that any adjacent peatlands are healthy is vital. We have a long history of forestry policy on peat, and the UK Forest Standard is the primary guide and, well, requirement for any forests that are being planted or restocked. And along with devolved country guidance on trees and peatlands from the different forest agencies, they generally presume against new planting on deep peat, often described as peat over 50 centimetres, but not exclusively. They also identify that there are vulnerable and important areas of shallower peat, under special circumstances. Unfortunately, we still have, despite that good policy, examples of new planting on peat. In part, this is driven by the high-level targets to get new planting achieved. But it's also in part through poor site preparation survey. Lenses of deeper peat are missed in the pre-planting surveys. And some of it, as I say, is overzealous attempts to meet tree planting targets and ignore the peatland goals. There is new guidance recently been introduced by Scottish Forestry, which seeks to protect shallow peatlands right down to 10 centimetres from ploughing as a preparation for planting. It doesn't prevent trees on those peat, but it stops the ploughing, which is seen as a major contributing to a major carbon loss on those shallower peats. The devolved policies also give some very good and useful guidance on allowing forests to be removed and trees to be removed to enable peatland restoration. And when plantations come to a harvestable age, the normal restocking requirement can be waived to allow for peatland restoration, primarily for biodiversity reasons or to protect important peatlands. And it's essential to say that this isn't dictated by a need to demonstrate a carbon gain. Again, some in forestry have attempted to make that claim, but the guidance says if it's an important peatland for biodiversity, then you don't have to restock. Unfortunately, there's no compulsion to remove plantations that would now be considered unsustainable on sensitive peatland areas. And we've seen examples of an old plantation in the middle of a beautiful raised bog, and the owner isn't minded to remove it and just wants to restock it. And without some form of compulsion, it can be difficult to make that protection and restoration of the surrounding peatland happen. So looking forward, if we're going to avoid conflict between trees and peat, we have the UK Forest Standard currently under review, and it's important that we don't go backwards, that we build on the existing good policies and double check that the new policy, the new Forest Standard, is supporting the equal goals of restoring and conserving peatlands as well as expanding forestry. We need better strategic planning to get the right trees in the right places and avoid putting pressure on peatlands as well as delivering forestry. We don't want compromised forests and damaged bogs as the outcome of our new policy standards. We also need to give greater consideration to developing woodlands where we want them within the peatland landscapes, whether that's rebuilding our fen carr woodland around lowland raised bogs or building mosaics of native woodland and peatlands in the uplands, or creating stabilising woodlands around upper hill slopes around blanket bogs. And finally, we need to monitor, again, what's happening as a result of these policies. It's very difficult at the moment to understand how much peatland restoration has been achieved with forest to bog. We don't know how much new planting is going on to peatlands, and we don't know how much restocking on peatlands is occurring. And all of these are vital to understand. So there is an obligation, I think, for the forest industry to get that assessed and monitored to understand the impact of their policies on peatland. So I hope the conclusion of this talk is that we need trees and we need peatlands. It's not which is better, it's how to deliver both, because if we don't, we're not going to meet our climate change or biodiversity goals. Thank you.
Well, Well, thank you very much, Clifton. That was great. A very comprehensive tour of Peatlands and forestry. In the context of a climate and nature emergency, this is a crazy conflict, and I do hope that foresters and people involved in this listen to your talk or listen to variants of that talk, because it's really important that we don't, make genuine mistakes in terms of addressing those particular emergencies. It's really important that we don't do that. We have another land use that I want to talk about, but just before I do that, just to remind people to use the question and answer function. And Sophie Chapman has joined us for the question and answer, I hope. And she's the DEFRA lead for Peatlands. So if you've got any questions for Sophie, do ask them through the question and answer tab. There's clearly one that has moved up the list that we'll be asking Sophie later. We're now going to move to Windfarms. I mean, if there's one thing about peatlands that we all know, that very often they are pretty cold, pretty wet places, and very windy, which of course makes them attractive to the wind farm industry and the renewables industry, which is, of course, the renewables is, of course, part of our the action that we need to take to get to net zero. So to talk about that competing land use pressure, we're going to move to Louise Guniston from the RSPB, who's a chartered planner, and she's been working in planning for 30 years now, much of which has been in consultation with the RSPB. So over to you, Louise.
Thanks, and hi everyone. I'm here from RSPB Scotland's planning team, and today I'm going to take 5 minutes or so to talk you through some of the casework and policy issues we've been dealing with recently in relation to onshore wind and peatlands. So I thought I'd start off with an extremely brief background to RSPB Scotland for those of you who don't know us. We're part of the RSPB, which is Europe's largest wildlife conservation organisation. We have over 1 million members in the UK, and across Scotland we manage 77 different nature reserves. In terms of our planning work, it's been driven increasingly by the need to tackle the twin crises, both climate and biodiversity. We see these two as closely linked, and that development must address both of these. In terms of onshore wind, our policy is that we do support increased rollout of onshore wind, but that this must be in harmony with nature. And now I'm going to talk a bit about some of our casework engagement and policy work. So the main focus for our policy work at the moment relevant to onshore wind is engaging with National Planning Framework 4, or NPF 4 as it's known, which is a really important plan as it will set the development context in Scotland for the next 10 years. And it covers a range of areas we're interested in, including renewables and peatland. So we're awaiting the publication of the final draft for consultation, which is due in a matter of weeks. But the position statement, which was published in November 2020, gave an indication of the direction of travel for these policy areas. And it seems like there's going to be some difficult decisions to be made and some tensions are emerging. The position statement on the one hand says that the Scottish Government will support renewable energy developments, including the repowering and extension of existing wind farms. But on the other hand, it says that they will restrict peat extraction and development on peatland. So the question is, are these two aims compatible, and how will that affect the patterns of development across Scotland in future? The exact wording of the policies are going to be really crucial here. So there are a couple of other issues that we picked up from the position statement that would be relevant to onshore wind development on peatland. The first is that the global climate emergency is expected to be made a material consideration for appropriately located energy development. But obviously the phrase appropriately located is open to interpretation, and we think that the biodiversity crisis must be given equal weight in decision making and be made a material consideration too. It's important to consider if there are any implications if net zero and climate change become an overriding factor in decision making. We may have more wind energy development in the short term, but are there any longer term impacts on peatland once those wind farms have been decommissioned? Another potential change in NPF 4 is the removal of Group 2 areas from spatial frameworks for onshore wind. At the moment, these are the areas of significant protection and include carbon-rich soils, deep peat and priority peatland habitat. We've been asking the question, is it best to leave these in spatial frameworks, and does it give developers and stakeholders more certainty in a plan-led process? we do think it's important at an early stage to steer development away from the best sites and those sites with the most potential for restoration. We've also suggested there could be a hierarchy of preference introduced, which would focus development on areas of low carbon soils in the first instance, exploring less damaging options first, and leaving development on peat as a last resort. So I don't have much time left today, but I did want to just quickly run through some issues that regularly crop up through our engagement with onshore wind casework. It's a bit of a mixed bag really, with the first one being the carbon calculator. It's now a standard requirement for all larger onshore wind applications, but there is a question mark about how it's supporting decision making and how decision makers are applying the outputs of the calculator according to other policies. The second bullet and the next two actually are all related really. This is just the issue around the split of responsibility between some of the agencies that are looking at the carbon impacts and the habitat impacts, and we do think there is potential there for a more holistic view of the impacts to be taken, particularly in terms of cumulative impact and those impacts out with designated sites. On the management and monitoring, we're regularly involved in habitat management plan and other enhancement works, but we do think there is potential there for better monitoring of those works in terms of the long-term impacts of those, both on the restoration side and also of the original impacts from the development. And finally, on peat depth, there are varying definitions of deep peat that are still applied in applications, and we're increasingly looking at the impacts on shallower peat soils. There's a depth of 0.3 metres, which is being looked at in terms of forestry developments, and we think that potentially that should be looked at for renewable developments as well. So those are some of the main policy and process issues we see as important, and while there are many different ways you could tackle each of these, just going to finally cover the things that we would see as crucial to make an onshore wind development on peatlands the lowest impact and the most beneficial it can be. Firstly is to ensure that development contributes to both net zero targets but is also nature positive. And to ensure this happens, there must be a holistic overview of impacts and strong policies to support truly sustainable development. The next one is that coordination of enhancement works is crucial. There are already examples of this, and we're involved in a cluster project that's been piloted in South Lanarkshire, but on an even bigger scale. The Scottish Climate and Nature Network, we proposed as a national development for MPF4, could provide the means to deliver strategic enhancement work through the coordination of funds at regional and local levels, with priorities for enhancement works being identified through a range of different spatial plans and interacting with the regional land use frameworks and the biodiversity strategy as well at a national level. So that's all from me today. Thanks very much for listening. I'll be in the Q&A afterwards, and if there are any other questions or queries, please do email the address that you see on the screen there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Louise. That was great. To my simplistic mind, 20% of the UK is covered in peat, which means 80% isn't. So surely there are many opportunities to develop the wind industry off peatlands. I mean, for me, I feel we need every tool in the box to address the climate emergency, and of course that means renewables and peatlands, not balancing one off with the other. But let's get a view from the wind industry. We're going to move across to Peter Robson. He's head of onshore ecology and GIS at Scottish Power Renewables, responsible for restoration of 8,000 hectares of blanket bog adjacent to wind farms around Scotland. Been with us on the programme, so he's been lead author of the 2019 Peatlands and Forestry Report for the IUCN UK Peatland Programme, and he's going to talk about how the wind farm industry is approaching blanket bog restoration. So over to you, Peter. And just to say, Peter's recorded this and won't be able to join us for the question and answer session.
Hi there, my name's Peter Robson. I'm head of onshore ecology for Scottish Power Renewables. I'm going to talk a bit about peatlands and wind farms. So take a step back for a minute and think about why we build wind farms and why we build them where we do, because one of the things that we sometimes get asked about is why can't we just avoid everything? And of course, that in practice is very difficult, and it's the same with peatlands. And what I've got here is a map on the left of the wind resource in Scotland, and the kind of purplish reddish areas are the highest wind resource. And what you can see quite clearly by correlating that with the map on the right, which is the SNH Peatlands map, is that actually a lot of the wind resource occurs in the same place where you get a lot of peatlands. Tends to be upland areas, tends to be exposed areas. So it's not so straightforward as to say we can just avoid it, and we have to kind of work around it. And we've been doing this for some time, and we've established a kind of set of norms with the various agencies that that have an interest in this and some of the stakeholders. And it follows a kind of typical environmental hierarchy of trying to avoid in the first instance as far as you can, and that's typically been driven by ecological constraints historically. So things like habitat classification, higher value habitats, particularly peatland habitats, Annex 1 classification habitats. They would typically be avoided completely, or to a greater extent anyway. But increasingly, we're starting to see that some of the avoidance there is because of carbon issues as well. And if you look at the map in the bottom right-hand corner there, that's a kind of typical map that we would generate looking at peat depth contours, which are derived from peat probing. So the kind of purplish areas, the darker purples, deeper peat, and the yellowish areas are very shallow or no peat. And it's a kind of a puzzle when you start trying to develop sites, when you've got a landowner boundary, which is the red line there, which is try and figure out, well, peatlands is one of the constraints, but we also have lots of other constraints. Particularly on this site, we had archaeological constraints, which were in the non-peat areas. And it's a case of trying to avoid as much of the peatland as you can, where you're going to put the turbines, and trying to link them together with access tracks, which again minimise the amount of peatlands that you're going to traverse. So that is a kind of the most fundamental method that we use to try and avoid peatland impacts in the first place. But of course you can't avoid everything, so we look at peat depth as a whole to say, well, can we at least minimise where we can orientate the turbine base so that we minimise it? And that's predominantly driven by waste and increasingly, again, carbon aspects. But waste was a big factor for that, which I'll come on to talk about in a minute. And your residual effects, well, you have to kind of offset those somehow, and that's usually been done by mitigation of degraded habitat. And again, that was typically driven by ecological issues, so it's habitat losses. So we lose bits of peatland habitat, we have to try and improve or create peatland habitat elsewhere to offset that. Now, some tensions remain, and I think these are really important because whilst we have this kind of accepted these norms about how we do development, I think because the drivers for different aspects of peat have been kind of siloed to different departments or different agencies or sometimes different stakeholders, we haven't had, in my view, a more kind of holistic view of what to do with various aspects of peat. So peat, when it comes to things like waste criteria, you dig peat out of the ground and we can minimize how much we dig out of the ground. The photo at the bottom here shows what we call a rock donut, which is where we now kind of put rock in a circle around where the turbine base is going to be and scoop out the middle, so we minimize how much peat comes out. But that peat has to go somewhere, and a long time ago it was decided that we wouldn't be allowed to put it in borrow pits anymore, which I think is a bit of a shame, because the top right picture there is a borrow pit we reinstated with peat in the Highlands about 15 years ago, and actually it's quite a nice bog pool habitat now. But most importantly, the peat in the borrow pit is secure, it's saturated, and it isn't going to slide off anywhere. So it's maintaining its kind of carbon benefit. Whereas the more typical sanctioned waste solution is to simply cast it alongside verges and around infrastructure, which creates this kind of layer of peat higher than the water table and ultimately will oxidize in the long term. But it solves a waste problem, but I don't think it's the best outcome for peat. Carbon is more of a strategic issue, and that's comes into play with the carbon calculator, which pits the value of the peat in carbon terms versus the carbon savings of renewables and things like forestry. And it's quite a useful tool. I think more scrutiny will be placed on that tool going forward, especially as the grid starts to decarbonise and we can look at losses of things like peat soils and forestry, to again make more kind of rounded decisions about, what are the best options for this bit of land. And finally, ecology, which is kind of one of the oldest drivers for peatlands because it came from a habitat perspective. But we still have issues around decisions made about what's the best ecological outcome. Things like, valuing a peatland habitat versus a forestry versus agriculture. And I think there's still quite a lot of tension around that as to what's the best outcome if we're trying to do something with the land. And I think one of the most significant ecological aspects was to do with the control of woodland removal policy that came into place about 2009, 2010. And prior to that, Scottish Power Renewables submitted many projects with huge amounts of peatland restoration. And this could all be really classified as enhancement and what would probably be called net gain these days in the common parlance. But since then, since the control of woodland removal policy came in, we've been able to submit much smaller areas of peatland restoration because a lot of these were historically on forestry, converting forestry on deep peat back to peatland habitats like the photos show there. And actually since then it's been very difficult to do because we've been required to do compensatory planting, which has made the cost prohibitively high, which means that I think there's been a real lost opportunity for projects to deliver more enhancement and more net gain for peatlands purely as a result of the control of woodland removal policy. So my key messages for today are that peatlands form one of many constraints determining where wind farm development can go. We have a set of established guidance and policy norms which we've been using in the industry for a lot of years, and I think that there's going to be more growth and more expansion of onshore wind, and that's only going to magnify all of these planning decisions that have to be made about how we fit peatlands into the landscape, wind farms into the landscape. And in the even longer term, beyond just expansion of new sites, repowering and reuse of existing infrastructure is going to be important. There's going to be decisions made there about losses of peatlands around existing sites versus new site development. But I think it's really important that we try not to make unilateral decisions because I think they've led to some poor outcomes for peatlands so far. And I think I would like to think that more discussion between the industry, agencies and interested stakeholders could lead to better outcomes by thinking about everything in the round. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, in your absence. Thank you to you for that really interesting view of peatland restoration from the wind industry, really useful. And thank you to all of the speakers today. And I just want to do a little round of applause to you all, and then we can start getting on with the questions. So let's kick off. We've got some brilliant questions and a great panel to answer them. So let's start off with a nice straightforward question, and I'm going to pick on Clifton. Should we stop planting on all peatlands, shallow and deep, until we have a much clearer evidence of the climate and nature implications? Clifton, nice and straightforward, yes or no?
Yes, is my first answer, with exceptions, because I was brought up in a policy world. I think it would be a good. We have two strong signals from government: more trees, protect and restore peatlands, and we can't resolve those. We need some finesse, and I think awaiting the science is going to take too long. So let's have some firm policy decisions. We don't need trees on peat for now, except where it's going to assist native woodlands, and then some rules to make sure that you don't harm recovering peatlands in the process. Perfectly capable of doing it.
Great, Clifton, just a little follow-up from me, and it was picked up somewhere else in the questions. Where the land management regimes change, often with removal of grazing, and as we go into agricultural transition, I guess there'll be less and less grazing, especially in upland environments. What about natural regeneration, and as natural regeneration starts to move on to peatlands? I mean, how do you view that?
So the natural regeneration onto peatlands is only a problem where the peatland is damaged and the water table isn't high. So because most of our natural regeneration schemes are happening adjacent to damaged peatlands, the trees are invading the bog. If we could recover the water tables, then it wouldn't be an issue. So there is going to have to be some strategic planning about this, so that if you want your natural regeneration of trees, make sure that you've addressed the hydrology of the adjacent peatlands.
Great, thanks, Clifton. Okay, can I just welcome Sophie onto the panel, who's from DEFRA, and I'm going to now ask her a really complicated question, which is, in order to meet the national carbon net zero target, well, we've got to meet that, and therefore the need for huge upscaling and restoration of peatlands, absolutely. Why has DEFRA not allowed other Treasury funds to be part of the match funding under the Nature for Climate Peatland grant scheme, which is operating in England? Sophie.
Sure, thanks, Rob, and hello, everyone. Well, the aim of the match funding requirement for the Nature for Climate Fund Peatland grant scheme was to try to leverage additional funds, because we were aware that with any significant investment, there is always a risk that public sector funding crowds out private sector, and we're keen to sort of design all our funds going forward to ensure that that doesn't happen, and also that it would complement the additionality requirements of the Peatland Code. Hence, that's why we stipulated that it had to be non-Treasury funds.
Thanks, Sophie. That seems fairly clear. I mean, on the Peatland Code then, can I bring in Brendan? The question here is, there seems to be a lack of confidence in entering into the Peatland Code from landowners and investors. Currently a sticking point, so it's all very well for DEFRA to say, well, you know, we need to bring in private funding, but if the landowners and investors aren't keen to do that, how do we fill that confidence gap? How do we encourage landowners to register and secure these much needed funds, not least to match things like the grant funding available in England? Brendan.
Yeah, so clearly a lack of confidence is a significant challenge. Just a quick bit of context before I answer the question. I mean, hitherto we've only had 2 projects going through the code in Scotland. That's since the code was published in 2015, but we've got around about 30 projects coming to us this year, all of whom are looking at peatland action and the code together. So the level of interest has suddenly gone through the roof, which I think is great. We've been kind of waiting for that to happen. In terms of providing some certainty, I guess there's 2 key things. One is, as I mentioned in the presentation, we're looking into having a price floor, some kind of price guarantee mechanism, and that's precisely designed to provide that confidence. There's a minimum level of financial return that the land managers can count on through their project. So, as I said, we'll hopefully reach a conclusion at fairly early in 2022. But I think the second thing really is around about this move to long-term funding that we're offering, the 3-year funding grants we're making available, and that commitment from Scottish Government of 250 million between now and 2030. The feedback we've had from contractors and others in the sector is that is providing confidence. It's not providing certainty, but it's providing substantial confidence of the direction of travel, which is we've now publicly committed to restoring all of our peatland. We've put substantial public funds on the table, but there is that investment gap that I set out. So behind the scenes, there's a range of things that we're doing, speaking to investors, land managers, contractors in the sector, to say, well, what other uncertainties are there, and how can we work with you to reduce those? Some should be fairly quick fixes, but some will take us, no doubt, several years to get right, to make sure the market is actually working for everyone. But be assured we're working those in the background as hard as we can.
Great, thanks for that. Clifton, do you want to come in and just add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things we've discovered from our research into land manager attitudes to the Peatland Code is a fear that if they embark on the Peatland Code and re-wet their peatland, that they will somehow be compromised in the income they can receive from government grants in future. So if you re-wet your peatland, you're not going to be eligible for agriculture payments going forward, is what's making many land managers nervous. So we need strong signals now from government. And to be fair, in England, we have a strong signal that if you've got a healthy peatland in future, you may well be in receipt of public payments for public goods. We haven't got that signal in Scotland yet. And I think it's one of the biggest things affecting land managers. Will that restored peatland be of value to me, or should I still stay with the drained peatland and gamble on having ongoing income from agri payments?
Thanks, Clifton. Let's just turn across to archaeology now as our kind of fourth most popular question. So let's go to Ben. There's a lot of stuff out there around advice for ensuring that we don't mess up the archaeology of peatlands as we restore them. The question here is, can we organise a common set of good practice guides for peatland restoration and archaeology? Any views on that, Ben?
Yeah, and it's a good question. I think it's something we're trying to maybe work towards more broadly. I think the appearance of the Historic England guidance is a kind of step in that direction, and hopefully will kind of be helpful more broadly. In terms of best practice, I think it's something that the Exmoor Mars project, for example, think at the IUCN conference, I believe, when we were in Loch Lomond, whenever that was, I think there was a poster presented by Martin Gillard and colleagues discussing kind of trying to develop best practice. We can think in those terms. I think the problem sometimes is it's kind of can also be horses for courses, depending on what landscape you're working in and so forth. So developing kind of one set of guidelines is kind of difficult, but probably the first place to go is the Historic England side of things, and I think we're going to be talking more with them as well about trying to develop that. And of course, in terms of particular parts of the UK of England, in particular, historic environment officers and science advisors, Historic England science advisors, are also available to help with that kind of formulation as well if people don't quite know what to do or where to go. I hope that answers the question, kind of.
No, that's great, Ben. I mean, and I think that it exemplifies the role of a UK peatland programme that brings together the best practice in England and elsewhere, wherever it is in the UK country, so that we can all benefit from that best practice and not just one country. So great to see that. Okay, I'm just going to switch now to land use planning. Question for Louise, and it's interesting. So in my naive world, of course, nobody would do anything but restore a peatland, because they're way too precious to start building wind farms or planting trees on them. But of course, the messy world of the real world is a little bit more complicated than that. So Louise, what's the role of land use planning to avoid conflict between things like afforestation, wind farms, peatland restoration, and so on?
Thanks, Rob. Good question. Well, as I said, I think during my presentation, planning works most effectively probably in looking at those different land uses at the spatial sort of regional or high level local scale. Really, it can be planning's role to look at the competing demands, and we do have spatial frameworks for wind farms that are meant to be done at every local authority planning level in Scotland, which is obviously ideal for mapping out where the wind farms are better placed in relation to other constraints. However, they don't always necessarily fit with the spatial planning for other things, for instance, forestry, because it's not counted as development. Local authorities do produce woodland and forestry plans, but they're not necessarily integrated into local development plans with the other land uses. And I do believe the regional land use frameworks, there's maybe a role there for them. That framework's been rolled out in Scotland, and we're very much hoping that in terms of the competing land uses, that they will also complement the land use planning system. So it's definitely a tricky one and not easily solved, that's for sure. But I mean, the point that I tried to make in my presentation was certainly that there is a strong role for planning there, and we very much don't want to see the existing spatial planning guidance that we already have eroded in the new policies coming forward. If anything, we think they should be strengthened.
Absolutely. Brendan, do you want to just come in as well?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think one of the challenges in the past is we've tried to think about this at the national level, and having a national spatial approach has always been very difficult for reasons which are probably obvious. What we're piloting at the moment in South Lanarkshire in Scotland is what we're calling a development framework approach, where we're looking kind of zooming in to a particular group of wind farms, including a Scottish power one, which would keep Pete happy if he was here today. But at a scale of around about 10 or 12 wind farms in a cluster, we think we can actually start to think spatially about the peatland, the trees, the turbines and other land uses, as well as other potential investments in nature-based solutions at that scale. So our view is, and that's kind of almost, as Louise mentioned, regional land use frameworks, it's almost slightly smaller scale than that again. But it's a scale at which we can have the right people, including the land managers, around the same table to say, there's a bunch of wind farms here, there's a bit of peatland we can restore over there, there's a little bit of conflict between the two, can we actually try and resolve that? So we're piloting that approach with a view to publishing the framework by the end of this year, and we're very much hoping that's an approach which can be rolled out in other parts of the country, and perhaps address some of those conflicts which do exist.
Fascinating. Okay, I'm going to do one last question for Naomi. Bring her in, and just a late question actually, but I think it's something that you could comment on, which is this point around, if you've got peatlands in great condition, you've been working away to get your land in fantastic condition for many decades. How do you continue to get, or how should you get payments for those ecosystem services that you're already providing, not the ones that you're about to build? And some people are concerned about the new environmental land management system in England, at least, which would almost make it more difficult to get those payments. So maybe you could comment about that, Naomi, and maybe Sophie could come in as well.
Well, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question, but I would say that if you had any habitat that was in really good condition, if it was a hay meadow or a fen or whatever, there was a commitment by Michael Gove that hasn't been changed, which is that people who are already doing the right thing and are managing stuff well won't be disadvantaged. And looking after a good peatland is exactly the same. And I take a lot of, I feel quite secure in that, saying that, because good public goods management is very difficult, and those people are to be celebrated and to be used as an educational thing.
Great,
there aren't a lot of them.
Sophie, have you, has DEFRA made sure that you've kept to Michael Gove's commitment?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to what Naomi said, really. I mean, as we set out in the England Peat Action Plan, that the new environmental land management schemes will provide the main mechanism for both restoration and management after 2024. And there shouldn't be concern about how peatland that is restored now will be treated in these future schemes, and certainly no reason to delay peatland restoration. So, if we want to meet our ambitions for net zero, then we need to restore peat now, and certainly not create incentives, anything that would disincentivize that.
Great. Well, that's very encouraging. Thank you, Sophie. Look, that's going to wrap up this session. Just to remind ourselves, apologies to you all for eating into lunch hour, but you've got 20 minutes, should be enough for us, Arnie. And then we're into the final exhibition session, so hopefully you'll enjoy that. It gives you a chance to talk to other delegates and chat to the exhibitors today. And we'll be returning to the conference sessions at 2:30, so looking forward to seeing you back then. But thank you again to all the speakers. Big round of applause to you all. And thank you to everybody who's been listening today. Thank you very much. Goodbye.